Welcome back. We seem to be on stream to continue. And right now, it's my pleasure to introduce once again to the comfort zone, to GEM FM, Dr. Triston B.J. Smith. He was a guest with us some weeks ago when I had Coach Naka Joseph and his basketball fraternity. They were here and he did explain, although he was not a player with Sparklers, the role that he played during that period. And I've been wanting to have him back, and he has graciously accepted to come back here this evening to speak with us. Good afternoon and welcome, Dr. Triston Smith. Sorry you had to be waiting so long because Murphy has been misbehaving this afternoon.
Good afternoon, Pablo. Thanks for having me.
Yes. To get started and to get right into the conversation, for those who were not here with us last time around and who's joining us maybe for the very first time and who has never heard about Dr. Triston Smith from Gouyave, can you just give us a short synopsis? Because, and earlier on, John Callis was playing this song by Pecos. And when I shared with Pecos the flyer, the promotional flyer for this afternoon's event, he said that was one of my players. So just walk us through that journey from Gouyave, being part of Sparklers, being a player with Coach Carlos Pecos Lewis, to being Dr. Triston Smith, cardiologist at the Wheeling Hospital in Virginia.
All right, thanks, Pablo. Well, what I must say is that it has been a very interesting and exhilarating journey to this point. So I was born in Gouyave, Dung Street. My grandfather was known as Boss or Kipuchi. He lived at the
Mr. Donaldson.
Mr. Donaldson, that was my grandfather. He lived at the back of the market. My mother was Jean, is Jean. She lives with me here now. And when I was about 4 years old, we immigrated to Guyana, where I spent 6 years. And then I went back to Grenada when I was about 10, attended the St. John's RC school for 1 year, did common entrance, and then went to St. John's Christian Secondary School, which we know as Shaper. And after Shaper, I went to TMR Show Community College. After that, I taught at Shaper for about 3 months, then at Happy Hill Secondary School for about 2.5 years. Then I went to Cuba to do medicine. But going back to what you spoke about in terms of my upbringing in Gouyave, it was very diverse. And I think it is that diversity in my growing up that has allowed me to excel in many areas, because when you grow up in Gouyave as a young boy, you can't be afraid of things. You have to get out of your comfort zone, so to speak, in order to be able to excel. So I tell people all the time, there are things, there's a lack of fear in whatever I want to do. Because when I came back from Guyana, when I was 10 years old, I went back to Gouyave and everyone could swim. I couldn't swim. Everyone was playing basketball and football. I couldn't play basketball. I couldn't play football. So I was sort of a misfit, if you'd want to call it that at that time. And I had to learn to do these things very quickly and on the fly. So, Pecos, Carlos Thomas was one of those people who
Carlos Lewis.
Carlos Lewis, yes, Carlos Lewis. He's one of those who guided me during that time. I did play for the St. John's Sports Under 16 team, and I was actually made it to the Under 16 national squad with Kennedy Mapp at that time. And then from the basketball side of things, we went through that with
Coach
Naka at that time. And although I didn't play basketball for Sparklers, I was very involved in the operations and in commentating and coaching and refereeing, etc. And from there, when I was at T.A. Marshall Community College, I was playing for the National Under-21 volleyball team. So although I wasn't good enough to be on Sparklers, I was good enough to be on the National Under-21 volleyball team that we became second in the OECS competition that was held in Antigua at that time. So balancing all of that in childhood, in those teenage years, were very important to me. In addition to that, I was a musician. I played for Metronomics Steel Band when they were when they were functional, and when they broke up, I played for the Further All Stars. I went to a few panoramas with them, and then I also played for I'm blanking on the name, Victoria, the Rainbow City All Stars, right? Rainbow City All Stars.
Victoria was Syncopators.
Syncopators, yes.
Syncopators, yes.
So I played with them for 2 years, and at that time when I started playing with them, I think Scholar was playing with us at that time.
Okay.
So I knew Scholar from back then. So my upbringing was, a mixture of academics, sports, music. Also played the harmonica with Sancho and his group around Christmas time. Always enjoyed that.
Yes, I remember that group.
Yeah, so it was a very colorful and beautiful upbringing that allowed me to be very multifaceted in what I do, and to not set boundaries. So when I put my mind to something, I said I'm going to do this, and I do it. So I went to after teaching at that Happy Hill Secondary School, I went to Cuba to do medicine. Did very well. Was top of my class at that time. Then I came back to Grenada. I had intended to go back to Cuba to do cardiac surgery, but when I went back to Grenada, life took a different turn, and I decided to come to the US, which was a big decision, because I already had when you graduate from Cuba in the top 5 in your class, you're given an automatic spot, whether you're a Cuban or a foreigner. If you're top 5 in your class, you get to choose whatever specialty you want to do. So I had chosen to do cardiology or cardiovascular surgery, and I just told them, listen, I need a 1-year break. I'm going to go home to Grenada for a year and come back. Then when I went to Grenada, seeing the situation and knowing the limited scope that there was for practice, outside of the Caribbean with a degree from Cuba, I decided to really take a chance or get out of my comfort zone to try to get into the US system, which is a totally different medical system than we had in Cuba. Okay. So I had to do all of the US examinations, did well in those. And knowing that I wanted to get into cardiology, I knew I had to score very high in those exams. So I did my best, put my best foot forward, was able to be successful with that, and then came to the US, where I did internal medicine, and then general cardiology, and then I did an additional fellowship in interventional cardiology. So I have board certifications in internal medicine, general cardiology, interventional cardiology, nuclear cardiology, and also echocardiography. And God has blessed me on this journey. After finishing training, I got a job at in Wheeling, West Virginia as a cardiologist. And within 3 years, I became the chief of cardiology there. And I just recently resigned from Wheeling Hospital because I'll be taking up a more expanded role at another hospital, which is Trinity Health System. I'll be the incoming director of the entire cardiovascular service line. So that was an opportunity that recently presented itself, and I decided to take. So I'll be starting that role in January of next year. So very excited. Every step of the way, there have been people who've helped. This journey is not something that I could have done on my own. I think my upbringing in Guave, the whole environment, playing sports, playing music,
Energy of Gouyave,
Energy of Gouyave, and also being grounded in the spiritual aspect.
right?
As well, I attended the Open Bible Church in Dung Street. Pastor George is the pastor there, and that kept me grounded. Always realizing that there's a higher power than myself, and when things get difficult, I know that there's someone to rely on to help me get through those difficult times. So Guave has infused itself in me in many ways and has helped me to be where I am at this point in my life and in my career.
Okay, we see, okay, you say that you'll be moving on from Wheeling Hospital, but we see that you have held various positions. Chairman in the Division of Cardiovascular Medicine, Clinical Director of Structural Heart and Complex High Risk and Indicated Patient Interventions, Interventional Cardiologist, assistant professor at internal medicine and so on. These responsibilities, in essence, what did they entail, and how would, your conduct of these responsibilities facilitated you being, qualified to take up this new role that you're going to be taking up?
Well, I must say that everything I do, I try to do it well. And it doesn't matter if it's a small task or a large task. I think ahead. I like thinking in 3 years and 5 year steps. But going from training to Wheeling Hospital, the cardiology program at that time wasn't very sophisticated. So I got there, assessed the situation, saw what needed to be done in order to give the people of that area the type of cardiovascular care that they needed. And then I just, got down to the task at hand. And as someone who was very people-oriented, I was able to galvanize the other cardiologists there, as well as the support staff in that hospital, to try seeing that we don't have to settle for mediocrity, that we can excel and become, one of the higher performing centers for cardiovascular care in the United States. So that's what I set out to do. Now, interventional cardiology is an area where we fix arteries in the heart without having to open the chest. So if someone has a heart attack, for example, and there's usually one of the arteries in the heart is 100% blocked, interventional cardiologist would be someone who goes in, usually through the leg or through the arm with some catheters, and put some wires, balloons down into the artery, and open up that artery, put a stent in to keep that artery open so that the blood flow can be restored to the muscle that was being affected. But my interest goes beyond that. I also like doing high-risk interventions. So there are some patients who have multiple blockages in the arteries of the heart, and just doing one simple stent procedure is not ideal for them. Those patients would go to have open heart surgery where the surgeon will open the chest and fix those arteries. But there are some patients who are also too sick for surgery. If we put them under general anesthesia, we open up the chest, we know that the likelihood of dying is high, or the likelihood of them recovering significant function is very low. Those are what we call the high-risk patients. And those are the patients that I would take to the cath lab, put a little heart pump into the heart to help it function while I work, and open up those arteries. And these procedures can take a long time, sometimes 4 or 5 hours, depending on how many blockages, how many arteries are involved. And having to use complex equipment, we put a little drill or a little sander down into the arteries of the heart if the arteries are blocked with calcium. So that's a special skill and special techniques that we use. And by doing so, we're able to open up those arteries and give those patients, some semblance of quality of life after the procedure. I also do structural heart. Structural heart intervention is a relatively new field where we replace and repair valves in the heart without having to open the chest. So I do something called TAVR, which is transcatheter aortic valve replacements. Aortic stenosis is a condition that affects patients usually above 70 years old. As we age, that aortic valve, which is the valve that allows blood to leave the pumping chamber on the heart on the left side and pump that blood that's filled with oxygen, pumps it out into the body so that it gets to the brain, the kidneys, the liver, etc. As we age, that valve becomes very stiff and it doesn't open well. And you can imagine that you have a valve that's not opening well, the back pressure in the heart becomes very high, and that can lead to patients having chest pain, can lead to them passing out, having severe shortness of breath. And the traditional way of treating aortic stenosis is by opening the chest, getting into the heart, taking the valve out, putting a new valve in. We've developed techniques now in structural heart where we're able to go through the groin, an artery in the groin, or an artery in the arm, and put a little tube in through which we pass a valve that's mounted onto a balloon, and we're able to get that valve into the heart, replace the stenotic valve that was there with these transcatheter valves, and that has really helped many people who initially were not candidates for open heart surgery. We started treating those patients, and over the past 3 years, the indication for that type of procedure have now moved from patients who otherwise were inoperable to now patients who are low risk for surgery. We put those valves in. Okay. I also do something.
Yeah, go ahead.
I also do something called transcatheter mitral valve repairs. The mitral valve is a valve on the left side of the heart that divides the top and bottom chambers, the left atrium and left ventricle. And in some patients, especially if the heart function of that patient is very weak, if the heart function has dropped, or if there's a ruptured cord or something within the heart, that valve can leak very significantly and lead to severe shortness of breath, etc. I'm able to go in, again, through a vein in the heart, in the leg, get into the right side of the heart, puncture a hole across into the left side, and put what we call mitral clips in to repair the leaky valves.
Speaking of leaky valves, I've heard that term before, and can it be a contributing factor, or can swelling in the legs be a symptom of it? And what are some of the techniques that can be used to addressing that issue? Is it something that is reversible? Can it cause clotting and so in the legs?
Well, it depends on which valve is leaking. So we have four valves in the heart. We have the aortic valve, the mitral valve, which are on the left side, and we have the tricuspid valve and the pulmonic valves on the right side of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
The ones that cause, now they can, if they leak significantly, any one of them, they can lead to swelling in the legs, because when the valve leaks, it causes the pressure in the heart to go up, right? And blood has to leave the legs to get back into the heart. So if the pressure in the heart is high, then it makes it more difficult for the blood to leave the legs to get back into the heart. Now, the one that causes the most swelling in the legs would be if that tricuspid valve, the one on the right side of the heart, isn't working well, if it's leaking severely. We, at this point, are going through multiple clinical trials for multiple devices that can decrease the leaking on that tricuspid valve, or the one on the right side of the heart. We expect within the next year or so to have a device that works very effectively for that, because surgery on that valve is very complex. So having a transcatheter way of doing it would be ideal. The mitral valve, the one on the left side, the leaking of that valve usually causes more shortness of breath. Okay. Because if remember the blood flows from the body into the right side of the heart, it then goes into the lungs, and from the lungs it goes into the left side of the heart. So the mitral valve is on the left side, and if there's a lot of leaking in the mitral valve, the blood cannot get from the lungs into the left side of the heart, so the lungs fill up with fluid and you get short of breath. So although that leaky valve on the left side can also cause swelling in the legs, it would first cause shortness of breath. So you try doing something and you have labored breathing. That would be the first indication as to that valve being defective. Can it be reversed? Usually not. Usually, if there's, let's say you had a heart attack, for example, and it affected the left side of the heart, you can have some leaking in the valve, and when the heart function recovers, that leaking can go away. But usually, if it's because of a structural issue with the valve, then that valve has to be replaced or repaired, and it doesn't really heal on its own.
Okay. What are some of the life practices that can lead to the development of some of the conditions that you've spoken to here?
Well, there are multiple. One of the big ones that we have in Grenada, in the Caribbean as a whole, would be rheumatic heart disease. So there was a period of time before antibiotics became the use of antibiotics became prevalent in Grenada, the Caribbean, and really the world, where patients would have rheumatic fever as a child, and they start developing shortness of breath in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and then that mitral valve becomes narrow. It's a strange pathology because the valve becomes narrow and it leaks at the same time. So there's nothing we can do for that. That's something that occurs in our elderly population, that because the antibiotics, the penicillin and so on that we use now was not available at that time. So those are the patients that we will definitely have to do some sort of a valve replacement. There are other conditions where it's just genetics. For example, the aortic valve, if you're born with a bicuspid aortic valve, for example, and the aortic valve should have 3 cusps or leaflets, as we call them. There's some people, about 1 to 2%, who have a bicuspid valve. They only have 2 leaflets. And the blood flow through that valve, the hemodynamics of the blood flow through that valve is different. So that valve usually degenerates earlier than normal. So those patients, again, there's really nothing you can do from a lifestyle standpoint. However, When we come to coronary artery disease, that's where we can make a huge impact, because coronary artery disease is driven by atherosclerosis, it's driven by hypertension, driven by diabetes, driven by smoking, tobacco smoking. So these areas and these health conditions, if we control those, then that would lead to less coronary artery disease, less heart attacks, and less heart attacks would lead to less heart failure, and less heart failure would lead to less valve disease, so to speak, in simple terms. So lifestyle, diet, exercise, everything we hear everyone preaching about on a day-to-day basis are things that we should bear in mind and be cognizant of, because our lifestyle over time determines heart health. Grenada and the Caribbean, we have a high prevalence of diabetes, and diabetes is a big driver of coronary artery disease, a big driver of strokes, and also a big driver of peripheral artery disease. So blockages in the arteries of the legs, etc., that can lead to limb amputations, etc., etc. So lifestyle modification from that standpoint helps.
Are you, well, I expect that you are, because I believe you referenced that term, arterial atheromatosis. What does that mean in real terms?
So atherosclerosis is what we term a hardening of the arteries of the heart. When we, as we age, and we eat different things, there are different types of cholesterol that we have built up within the body. One of those cholesterol is the LDL cholesterol, which is what we call the bad cholesterol. It's low density lipoprotein. That gets into the walls of the arteries, and it then starts an inflammatory response, an inflammatory cascade that makes new cells, but these cells are not stable. There's an inflammation pocket there, and that can lead to either that area rupturing, causing a heart attack, or progressive narrowing of the artery and deposits of calcium, etc., in that area. So atherosclerosis is that process that happens gradually over time that leads to narrowing, hardening of the arteries that can then decrease blood flow to different areas, including the heart, leading to heart attacks, leading to chest pains, leading to strokes, and leading to peripheral artery disease.
You mentioned the, how you call it, as a contributing factor, cholesterol as a contributing factor to that situation. Now, what if one does the blood work and the cholesterol levels are good, the kidney and other organs, the readings are good? But they're still, faced with that situation of arterial atheromatosis. What can be responsible for that?
Well, what's responsible for that is usually a subtype of the cholesterol that was checked. So there's what we call familial types of hypercholesterolemia. So you can have a lipid panel done, as we call it, and the lipid panel looks normal. But within the LDL, within that bad cholesterol, there are also subtypes. And there's a subtype called Lp(a), lipoprotein A, which we have found can be very elevated in patients who have normal cholesterol. So our normal panel, the panel comes back normal, but this Lp(a), when we do subtyping, that's high. So what we need to do at that point is to lifestyle modification and medicines to drive the LDL, that bad cholesterol, as low as possible in hopes of decreasing this lipoprotein little a. So that's something that, you know, we don't do enough of. That's an expensive test. But whenever I have patients who face this situation where the cholesterols are normal, but they have advanced atherosclerosis, they've had a heart attack, then you know you need to go a step further and look for the different lipid subtypes. And when you see a subtype that's high, like LP little a, you know that's what you need to function. That's what you need to focus on.
Okay, interesting. We hear of people of African origin and so being prone to this one, the issue of the prostate and so. Are there any indicators as to people of that you know, that ethnicity being more prone to heart situations than others? Do we have a situation like that?
Yes, we do. We 100% do. The reason is unclear. It could be genetically based. However, it could also just be due to disparities in healthcare, and I'm being frank. It could be due to the way we as academic community go about looking at health and healthcare. We know that in the US, there is a disparity between healthcare that's given to Caucasians as compared to healthcare that's given to Black people or people of African descent. Part of that goes back to how our clinical trials are set up and how they're conducted and the guidelines we have. So especially in cardiology, we're very guideline and evidence-based, focused and driven. So we'll do these what we call clinical trials, which are in essence controlled experiments. Based on that, we get some results, and based on those results, we implement interventions to decrease whatever we're seeing that's abnormal in those results. So for example, at this point in time, what we use for risk classification or to tell someone what their risk of having a cardiac event is within 10 years is a score that's called the Framingham risk score. Now, Framingham, that risk score was developed in Framingham, Massachusetts, where everyone is white. So we're transposing a subset or results from a group of people who share a different ethnicity to African, to patients from African origin or Indian origin, but we generalize that and we generalize our treatments along those lines. Now, when a better way of doing it would be to have a risk model where you have a good sample or a good pool of people from African origin, Indian origin, Asian origin, and Caucasian origin, and then use that data we get and extrapolate it, and that will be more representative of the population. So a lot of the treatments that we use were tried and tested in populations that are not heavily African American or Afro-Caribbean. And that could be one of the contributing factors as to why African Americans, Afro-Caribbean people have more heart disease, etc., than their Caucasian counterparts. The other would be access to healthcare. We know that a lot of the African American communities are poorer than the Caucasian communities, and therefore that ability to pay for medicines, follow-up visits, etc., is less than in the Caucasian community. The same goes for the Caribbean. Some of the high-tech things that we have here, we just don't have it in the Caribbean. So that again would lead to some disparity in healthcare and healthcare outcomes. But at the core of it also is that there are some genetic predispositions that we have as people of African origin that can lead us to have more coronary artery disease and heart disease. We're more prone to being diabetics because of our genetics. So that is something that we have to be able to control in order to control our future, control our destiny, because these are things that are in our hands. In the Caribbean, we have become very westernized in our dietary habits, and that has impacted the prevalence of diabetes significantly. And because of that, or because the prevalence of diabetes is increasing, and we don't have access to the latest drugs because they cost so much, then the diabetes isn't under control. Then that leads to the coronary artery disease and so on down the line, because it's all a chain cascade of events that leads to this. So, in short, to answer your question, it's a very difficult and multifaceted, complex environment that cause this disparity. But we do know that people of African origin tend to be impacted more significantly from heart disease than other races.
Oh, yes, interesting. You speak about the facilities and the services. We see that at your Wheeling Hospital, there's 223 beds, and you have 300 primary care and specialty physicians. We are struggling here in terms of just regular medical doctors, much more for specialty physicians. Do you have any connection at all with any of the local medical facilities from SGU or hospital or whatever, in terms of being able to assist, or to provide services that are lacking down here?
So I don't have any formal affiliations at this point.
Okay.
I do keep in contact with some of my colleagues back home. Dr. Devon Francis, for example, Francis Martin, for example. We keep in contact, and Taisha Donald. If there are issues that they're facing, they need me to weigh in, I do. What I have done is the CHORS project. CHORS is a group that has been providing pediatric care in Grenada for a very long time, over 20 years. They provide a lot of orthopedic, cardiac, as well as oncologic services to Grenada. And Dr. Beverly Nelson has been very, very instrumental in keeping that program going. Some of the patients that were pediatric patients from a heart standpoint, they're now young adults and adults. So they wanted an adult cardiologist to be on board. So I joined up with them and I've been seeing those patients with them. We didn't do it this year because of the COVID pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And although I can't divulge a lot of the information because this is
I understand that. Yeah.
I was approached by St. George's University to join their visiting cardiology program and to bring some level of what I do to Grenada. What that would look like at the end of the day, I can't say at this point because there'll have to be some capital investment, etc., made. But we've had some very positive initial discussions. Some more discussions are planned, and I think if we're able to come up with a model where I'll be able to lend some of that, the services that I do here to Grenada for Grenadians and people in the Caribbean, it's something that I'll embrace with open arms because I think I owe that to my people and the people in the Caribbean.
You mentioned earlier about the relationship between one of the known non-communicable diseases and heart attack, which is diabetes. I expect that hypertension would also be the case. Are there any other such conditions that can lend itself to the development of heart diseases?
Those are the big two, and those are the big two that we focus on. But other lifestyle things would be smoking, for example, cigarette smoking. We do know that there is, whether you're African American, Afro Caribbean, white, Indian, tobacco smoke has a high correlation with coronary artery disease. So then high cholesterol, as we mentioned before, is another one, especially the bad cholesterol, that LDL. So those are the big risk factors that we try to modify to make sure that you don't develop coronary artery disease. Another thing that can lead to heart attacks, etc., goes back to the song Pecos was singing earlier today. Drugs, the use of illegal drugs, especially cocaine, and that can cause spasms within the arteries of the heart. And when the heart artery spasm, that can also lead to heart attacks. But what we focus on from a big picture standpoint would be the diabetes, hypertension, smoking, high cholesterol, and of course, illicit drug use. Those are all things that we can control apart from genetics, because we're born with genetics. There's nothing we can do to change the genetic profile, but by controlling these factors, we can modify how genetics can affect us in the long term.
Okay. Earlier on, we spoke about your responsibilities at the Wheeling Hospital. And we see that as chairman of the Department of Cardiology, you, during your employment in that situation, that you develop policies geared towards decreasing waste and maximizing revenue cycle. That is sort of indicative of responsibilities outside of the regular medical or health issues. That is somewhat of financial management. Can you speak to that issue? How were you able to accomplish that?
Well, I believe that as physicians, we also have to be good stewards and be financially and fiscally responsible with what we do. So our aim as physicians should be to, or not just as physicians, but as healthcare systems, should be to deliver the highest quality product at the lowest cost possible. Not that, and not allow cost to affect quality. So I'm saying highest quality, lowest cost. So you what I had to do was, look across the board at what we did, what types of products we use, what types of products we can eliminate within that pipeline, but not compromise care or not compromise outcome of what we do. Because at the end of the day, if we have a quality product that people cannot afford, then it makes no sense. We lose revenue, and when you lose revenue, that shows up on a balance sheet somewhere, and then the CEO or the chief financial officer will be saying, well, this is going to bankrupt the hospital. Things like structural heart disease, the margin for error in terms of cost is very small, because, for example, one of the valves, this transcatheter valves, costs $40,000, right? So just the valve itself, that doesn't include labor and everything else that we have to purchase to get the valve in. So when we started doing transcatheter aortic valve replacements, we started with general anesthesia. So the patient would come in, we'll have the anesthesiologist put them to sleep. We used what we call a transesophageal echocardiogram. It's a little ultrasound probe that we put down into the food pipe. The food pipe lies right beneath the heart, so we're able to see the heart well. And we perform these procedures with general anesthesia, and this transesophageal echocardiogram. But with that, that also comes along with having the patient go to the post-op area, having the patient go to the intensive care unit afterwards for close monitoring, and the patient will then have to remain in the hospital for about 3 days after we did the procedures in that way. Where we shifted to that helped with cost was to do the procedure without general anesthesia. So the patient just gets some medicines to relax them. They're awake. We don't have to put them on the breathing machine, so that eliminates cost. Then they don't have to go to that prolonged post-op area. They can go straight upstairs, so that eliminates cost. And they go home in 1 day. So instead of occupying a hospital bed for 3 days, they now occupy a hospital bed for 1 day. So cumulatively, that saves a lot of money for the hospital. It saves a lot of money for the patient, and the overall experience is better. And we were very early adopters of this, what we call minimalist approach to the aortic valve replacements. I know when I think we had done about 20 cases with the general anesthesia, and then I looked at the team and I said, we're going to start doing this minimally in a minimalist way. And they looked at me like, are you crazy? Are you crazy? I'm like, no, well, I knew of a hospital that did it in Charlotte. So I flew the team out there. The device company sponsored us. We went out, we saw what they did, how they did it, and we came back and we started to do it. So looking at the process that we use and seeing where we can eliminate waste is something that goes a long way in decreasing cost. Another thing we did, or a lot of programs do, we do these cases in what we call a hybrid cath lab. So if something were to go wrong in terms of putting the valve in, then the surgeon is there. He has to open the chest and do it the traditional way. We've done about 100 of those. We never had to open the chest, but every time we did one, we had to open the whole surgical equipment. And then that surgical equipment then has to be sent to sterilized, or those that can be sterilized, they're sent into waste. So after about like 75 to 100 cases, I said, well, we've never used it. If we've never used it, why are we opening it? I'm pretty confident in the team. I'm pretty confident in our skill. That's a huge waste that we have opening this surgical tray every single time when we're not going to use it. So instead of that, we came up with a plan where we started having very small surgical trays that has just the bare minimal for what we'll need. And that again was something that was able to decrease costs. So that's just one example from a transcatheter aortic valve replacement standpoint. But that had to be replicated across the board in all the cardiovascular service lines. And when you're doing these procedures and you have multiple companies involved, then you start haggling on price, et cetera, to get better rebates, et cetera, to enhance the profitability of the program, so to speak.
I see that at your hospital, there was a circular that went out saying that in relation to the COVID-19 situation, that you are experiencing increased numbers of positive patients, and that the hospital is currently at 75% capacity now. That was on the 18th of November. What is the situation there? And do you play any significant role in treating with COVID-19 patients, seeing that breathing and so is one of the evident conditions that comes with the challenges of COVID-19 and people being on ventilators and so?
Yes, COVID-19 has been a challenge to, I would say, all healthcare providers and all healthcare systems across the world. At the beginning, we weren't fully sure about the scope and how impactful it was going to be. So what we had to do was convert some of our existing rooms to negative pressure rooms. We had to come up with plans for acquiring more ventilators, as well as a system that would allocate ventilators to the appropriate people should the surge exceed capacity. And I think that was one of the things that made me that gave me chills, because we had to have what's called like a disaster management plan, and the hospital had a certain amount of ventilators. Then we had a certain amount of anesthesia machines in the ORs that we could convert to ventilators. But then we were thinking, what happens beyond that? How if that capacity is exceeded, who do we know who to take off the ventilator, who to give a ventilator to? And that was a very difficult discussion, because that's an ethical dilemma, to have someone on a ventilator who's very sick, to say, okay, we're going to take this ventilator from someone and give it to someone else because we think they have a better chance of survival. So we had to come up with these teams to make these decisions. And unfortunately, I was one of the people who was chosen to have to make that decision. But fortunately, I did not have to. So you'd have to.
So you have the responsibility, but you haven't been faced with having to make the decision as yet.
Yes, but that's something that weighed very heavily on me, because every day I'd have to go in, look at the list of COVID positive patients. We calculated something called a SOFA score to tell us the severity of the illness, along with parameters of the patient and chances of recovery, etc. And I kept looking at that list every day, see who has the high scores, just in case we needed to get to that point. We haven't gotten to that point, and I think Hopefully we won't, because of the vaccine that we should be rolling out here in the US from next year. And we've also got a better handle on the therapeutics that we can use for these COVID-19 patients to decrease mortality and also decrease the length of hospital stay. So I think the response from a lot of the hospitals in the US, at the beginning, I think we were all kind of shocked into action. But despite the large number of cases, despite the large number of deaths, I think that most hospitals have done the due diligence in trying to help these patients and also limit the spread of the disease. Hopefully this second wave looks like it's starting to plateau, and hopefully with the vaccine around the corner, we'll then be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Speaking of the vaccine and therapeutics, well, first therapeutics, there is that belief, or I should say, there is that discussion that's been going on, that some people, based on the condition that in which they end up in the hospital, they are put on the ventilators and do not receive the appropriate therapeutic treatment. And that is contributing significantly to the number of fatalities that we ended up with. What do you say to that?
Certainly that was true at the beginning, because we didn't understand the full pathophysiology behind the disease. We thought that early ventilation or putting the patients on a ventilator early helped. We've since found that that's not the case, because the patients who ended up on the ventilators usually didn't get off. So the whole thrust now is to try keeping you from being on the ventilator or getting onto the ventilator. And in what has helped with that are the therapeutics that are out there, the dexamethasone, the monoclonal antibodies, etc., that are helping to decrease inflammation within the lungs and decreasing the need to be on ventilators. At the beginning, we thought ventilators were the be-all and end-all, but we've since figured out that that's not the case. So you're definitely right. At the beginning, it was you come in, you're short of breath, we put you on the ventilator. Now we try keeping you off of the ventilator as much as possible.
Is it possible for one to contract COVID-19, be a serious patient to the point of you cannot feed yourself and you cannot go to the bathroom by yourself and still not be hospitalized, be treated at home and come away from it and be revived?
Certainly, I mean, there are patients who've been very sick, and they were at home, they wrote it out at home. We don't advocate that. We'd advocate that if you are experiencing those symptoms, that you should go to the hospital to get treated. But yes, there are cases where people had, especially younger people, they can get very, very sick, but they recover as well, and they recover fast or quickly. The elderly population, that's not the case. The elderly population, once they get very sick, it's very difficult to pull them back from the edge. So if the symptoms are to the point of being debilitating like that, then you should go to the hospital. You should seek specialist help.
So what do you anticipate as a consequence of the rollout of this vaccine? Is it going to result in it being a cure for someone who contracts COVID-19, or just something that restricts one from contracting COVID-19?
That's a very, very interesting and loaded question. And so I'll try to be as political as possible.
Okay.
So here,
Mm-hmm.
we know that the vaccines work. The vaccines work in decreasing your chance of getting COVID-19. I think the Pfizer vaccine was somewhere in the 90%. The Moderna is about 86%. There's a vaccine from Russia, the I think Sputnik 5 vaccine that wasn't really trialed, but they thought it was safe, so they're giving it out. Then there's a vaccine from Australia that they just shut down that trial because the patients who got the vaccine, they were testing positive for HIV when in fact they were HIV negative. Are we still on?
Yes, I'm on.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the vaccine we know is going to decrease the likelihood of someone acquiring the disease. Does that give lifetime immunity? That's something that's left to be seen. It's highly unlikely that it would give lifetime immunity. Just as if we take the flu shot this year, that does not confer to us lifetime immunity. I think the same would be for the COVID-19 vaccine. Certainly, it will help decrease hospitalizations, decrease deaths, and certainly allow economies to be open back up for business. But I do believe that there's a lot of work that has to go on besides just giving the vaccine. So the vaccines, although they've been approved, the rollout at this point is still under what we call a phase 4 trial. And the phase 4 trial is to be looking at the mass population who are receiving the vaccines to see if any sorts of unintended consequences happen, just to make sure that the safety is good. We call it post-market surveillance, and that's not unique to the vaccine. That's something we do with every new medicine or vaccine that comes onto the stage. We do post-market surveillance. So we still will be keeping a very close eye on the disease. We'll be keeping a close eye on the patients who've received the vaccine to see if any untoward side effects should show itself that we did not see in the clinical trials. But certainly, I'm happy that the vaccines have been approved. I think the rollout, should it be swift as been reported, then that will help a lot in terms of decreasing the lockdowns and getting back to some semblance of life. Because one of the big things that we overlook in the whole COVID pandemic is the number of people who have also died because of lack of care. So COVID-19 has impacted deaths significantly, but there are a lot of other people who died simply because they didn't want to go to the hospital. So they would have had a heart attack and they stayed at home. They're having some sort of a headache that could indicate that they have meningitis, but they're so afraid of going to the hospital and contracting COVID that they stayed at home. I just recently reviewed a study out of England that showed the rate of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, meaning you just die at home from a heart issue. That was, I don't want to misquote, I think it was 60% higher than normal. So there's a large population group that are being affected, and their lives and health is being affected beyond COVID. So getting the vaccine out there, giving people confidence that they can go to the doctor's office, they can go to the hospital and not have to be worried about becoming infected, I think that also is going to help that other part, that hidden part that we don't speak about, in terms of getting care to the patients who need it, who are not seeking that care at this point.
We see that your rating as a cardiovascular operative is very high across the US. You have a 4+ in most cases, and you have published a number of papers. What are some of the papers that you have published, and what's the significance of these publications towards the delivery of heart care?
Well, I'm happy that my colleagues and you guys recognize the work that I do. In terms of publications, I think the one that I'm most, I would say, most proud of, so to speak, would be the work I did on computational fluid dynamics, to develop a model that from which we can use a CT scan to estimate pressures within the lungs or within the pulmonary arteries. I think it was, I would say this is the one I'm most proud of, because that's one that, again, took me out of my comfort zone. During that project started during fellowship. One of my mentors, Dr. Morali, he was a pulmonary hypertension and heart failure transplant specialist. And we were brainstorming on ideas. I was seeing these pulmonary hypertension patients in his office. And by the time these patients come for care, they were so sick that, starting medicines, etc., didn't do much to help them in the short and long term. Now, pulmonary arterial hypertension is one of the most deadly diseases out there. There's no cure. We can only hope for to decrease the progression of the disease over time. And that disease is the definitive diagnosis for that disease is a right heart catheterization, where we go through a vein in the neck or the groin and put a special catheter into the heart and into the lungs to measure pressures and then make some calculations. But that's an invasive test. So since it's an invasive test, a lot of people get missed, those who have pulmonary arterial hypertension. So we were looking for a way to non-invasively predict what the pressures in the lungs are. And he put me on to a professor. He was a professor at Carnegie Mellon University at that time, Dr. Finol, and Dr. Ender had a postdoc student who was Vitaly, a Russian, and he and I collaborated to develop what's called a computational fluid dynamic model that can tell us from a CT scan what the pressures are, or it can estimate what the pressures are within the lungs, and also give us a sort of a heat map as to where those pressures are high. I said it took me out of my comfort zone because, Dr. Ender Finol and Vitaly, they're biomechanical engineers or biomedical engineers. And I don't have an engineering background. So there was a lot of mathematical formulas and so on that I had to assimilate and understand so that we were speaking, the same language. But it turned out that we developed that model, we published it. It's been widely cited by a lot of other researchers who've taken up that same sort of an interest. And then, I became a reviewer for the Annals of Biomechanical Engineering, which is the premier biomechanical engineering journal in the world. So somewhere along the line, someone realized that, my talent goes beyond just cardiology, but I'm also able to integrate hard scientific physics, etc., into what I do, so that I was made a reviewer for that journal. So that was one of the publications I think I was most proud of, because it's something that was never done, and it sets the stage for other researchers to use it as an example and refine that process. Also have done some work on obstructive sleep apnea, which we had spoken about
in the previous program.
Mm-hmm. Have some more publications coming on that. There are 2 manuscripts that my group submitted, and it's currently under review.
But just for those who may have missed that previous program, can you just elaborate a little bit more on this sleep apnea? Because I can tell you for a fact, I know of many of our people here who suffer from sleep deprivation for one reason or another, and essentially they don't really have a full appreciation of what's happening to them, why it's happening, and so. And so I know that is a condition that is sort of prevalent around here.
Yes, so obstructive sleep apnea is a condition where you stop breathing during the night. The reasons for that, or the usual anatomical features would be if you're overweight, have a large tummy, a short neck, a large tongue. So when you go to sleep, what can happen is that the tongue can fall to the back of the throat and obstruct blood airflow into the lungs. So these patients usually snore a lot, and for certain periods they will just stop breathing. So if you have a relative, a friend, a loved one who snores a lot, and then you hear a pause for 30 seconds or 40 seconds, there's no snoring. At that point in time, that person isn't breathing. And because they're not breathing, the body becomes deprived of oxygen. So you're asleep, the brain is asleep, but the body is deprived of oxygen. And since the body is deprived of oxygen, the body's response is a fight or flight response. So it then sends out adrenaline. So your heart starts beating faster. You start sweating. The blood pressure goes up, and you're asleep, but the body is revved up. So a lot of people who have obstructive sleep apnea, when they wake up in the morning, they still feel tired. Although they would have slept for 8 to 10 hours, they wake up and they're like, if I can just have another hour of sleep, I should be fine. But what happens is that sleep apnea, because the body is in that constant state of fight and flight, cause the blood pressure to go up. So, of course, those patients they'll be hypertensive. The what we call is circadian rhythm, the hormones that the body produces, ebbs and flows during the day. There's some peaks and some lows, some peaks and some lows. And one of those peaks happen in the morning with a substance called cortisol that affects a lot of functions within the body. When you don't sleep well, that peak and flow of those hormones, that becomes disrupted. And when that becomes disrupted, it then puts stress on the whole body. So patients with obstructive sleep apnea, they're more prone to having hypertension. They're more prone to having diabetes. They're more prone to having what we call atrial fibrillation, which is an abnormal beat or abnormal rhythm of the heart. And they're also prone to having more blood clots because the body also produces what we call procoagulant factors that makes the blood more prone to forming blood clots, so they can have blood clots in their legs, blood clots in the lungs, etc. So although we traditionally saw snoring and sleep disorders as a sleep or a lifestyle issue, we now recognize that it's more of a health issue. And I suspect that within the next probably 3 to 5 years, you'll be seeing obstructive sleep apnea as one of the risk factors for coronary artery disease and one of the risk factors for heart failure, pulmonary hypertension, etc., because it is one of the drivers that affects multiple things within the body that leads to poor health.
Okay. Yes, I felt it necessary to get you to elaborate on that a bit more because I know of people who snore very heavily, and I always remember a gentleman who lived on the lands, and you come from the cinema in the nighttime and you can hear him from the time you leave the cinema. Everything is just quiet now and you can hear him in his house snoring and so on. I know people who experience that kind of condition. Any of the other papers that you can, refer to as being of note and being significant before we wrap up in a little while?
Another one I'm happy about is the use of an intra-aortic balloon pump in a patient who was waiting on a heart transplant. So usually an intra-aortic balloon pump is a little device that we put into the body. We put it into the aorta, and it's a balloon that opens and closes in synchrony with the heart to try to get blood flow down the coronary arteries. Usually that device we put through the leg, an artery in the leg. But a patient who is in the hospital awaiting a heart transplant, you would want to keep that patient as conditioned as possible. You want the muscles to be moving. You want them to be able to walk and keep that muscular tone, because the transplant itself and the transplant meds after transplant can cause atrophy of the muscles, and the recovery process is not simple. So we had a patient who was awaiting transplant. He was there for quite a long time, and we decided that he needed to get up and move. So instead of using the arm, instead of using the leg, we put it in through the arm. And by doing so, that patient was able to be in the hospital, but still participate in physical therapy, etc., so that when he did have his transplant, he got through that process much faster than other people. And that's another paper that has been widely published. Another one would be the use of one of the early ones I did in terms of herbal supplementation. I had a young patient who came in and he had a heart attack. He was in his mid-20s and he had a heart attack, and we were like, oh my God, how can someone in their mid-20s have a heart attack? And I spoke to him. I asked, hey, do you use any supplements? He told me yes, he used this thing called Jacked 3D. I looked at it, and there was some questionable ingredients in there. And then I did a literature search, and I saw that there were two soldiers who died about maybe a year or so before, and that same substance was in their system. So that led me to review a lot of the literature on herbal supplements. I believe in herbal supplements. I encourage my patients to use herbal supplements. I mean, my teaching in Cuba involved a lot of these traditional herbal or phytotherapy, as we call it. But we also have to understand that the herbal supplement market is not regulated. There is no FDA regulation of these supplements. So the manufacturers can say whatever they want, and you really don't know what's in there. So I published this this paper about the patient who would use the Jack 3D, and it had the citrus aurantium, etc. in it. And that again got a lot of citations. And I would say a year and a half or so afterwards, the Jack 3D and those supplements were pulled from circulation, from all the GNC stores. And I think my paper was one of those that was cited in that in doing that. So a lot of exciting things and other exciting things that I'm working on that hopefully can come to fruition.
So yeah, go ahead.
There's some others I'm working on that I can't talk about,
right?
because you never know who's listening. And then
right.
One of the things I've realized early on here is that you need to keep a lot of cards close to your chest, and if you're going to divulge your intellectual property, there has to be some understanding from the party that you're going to do that with, that you have to have some stake as well. I think I was naive when I started, but now that's something that I've sort of figured out.
Okay. So going forward, you say you shall be moving to some new responsibilities. Can you just walk us through that, and what do you anticipate? What are some of your expectations and the overall responsibilities? Can you just refresh us on that?
Well, at Wheeling, I was the chief of cardiology. I'm going to Trinity Health system, where I'll be the medical director of the cardiovascular service line. So the cardiovascular service line takes into account not just cardiology, but also cardiac surgery, vascular, etc. So it's a bigger portfolio, a lot more responsibilities, and a lot of product building that I'll be doing there. So I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a challenge, but as I say, I never back down from a challenge. I have a wonderful group of people who I work with at Wheeling Hospital. Some of them will be transferring to that hospital with me as part of that project. So it's exciting, and I look forward to doing some great things there. I was asked by that hospital CEO and by their national body to come in and elevate the status of that program, and that's what I intend to do. I know it'll take some work, but that's what we from Guave do. We put our heads down. We never take no for an answer. We never say no. We never say we can't do it. So I'm looking forward to that challenge starting in January.
So you'll be taking the Energy of Gouyave with you to Michigan.
Definitely, I'll be taking the Energy of Gouyave.
Yes. Okay. Any final words for us here in Grenada with our healthcare system and so on, as to how we can better provide for people who need healthcare in the country, in an efficient and less costly way?
That's a very difficult question to ask. I keep up with news in Grenada. I always read the Grenada Today, the Informer, listen to the radio when I can, and I know that there's a lot of concerns about the healthcare system in Grenada and healthcare in Grenada as a whole. I mean, I empathize a lot with our healthcare professionals, because I was there. I understand what they go through. The fact is that healthcare is expensive. Healthcare is very expensive, and I think we probably were or are a bit spoiled because of the relationship we had with Cuba and the revolution, where as part of that collaborative process, medicines were free and doctor visits were free, etc. And that's wonderful and that's great. But in the current environment, in the current healthcare environment, where care, especially specialty care, is so expensive, it is very, very difficult for any government within the Caribbean to give the level of service and level of support that the population expects, because that's just the law of economics. The cost of equipment and the cost of human resource is so high that I don't think that our smaller countries are able to devote the necessary capital expenditure to keep up with the demand. So I think we have to become more resourceful, and we have to look for what works within our context within the Caribbean. One of those would be us taking responsibility for our health. In that, I mean controlling the risk factors that we can control. We are importing into the Caribbean and into Grenada the lifestyle of the developed countries without having a healthcare system of the developed countries. So there's a disconnect there. So our obesity rate is increasing, our diabetes rate is increasing, our hypertension rates are increasing. That leads to more cancers, more heart disease, more strokes, and the cost of care for these conditions are very high. So what we need to do is focus on primary care and focus on primary prevention. And patients and people have to understand that not just because you're not feeling sick doesn't mean that you're not sick, right? If your cholesterol is out of control, you may not have a heart attack now, but you can have that 10 years from now. And that's a burden to the system. Your diabetes is not under control now. You feel good. You don't have chest pain. You don't have, it's not like the thing about hypertension and diabetes, etc., is that you don't feel the effects until the damage is already done. So what we have to do is put in place strategies to prevent the damage from being done. And a large portion of that is about educating the population, and the population being willing to accept on a personal level some responsibility for their health. There's no reason why our diabetes levels and our obesity levels should be that high. I mean, we don't have winters. We can walk every day. In Gouyave, we swim every day. There are parks, there are things that we can do to keep us active, but we've fallen into the trap of sitting on the couch, watching TV, enjoying those, cushy things that make us become sedentary, and that leads to poorer outcomes. So that's from a personal level, that's what we can do. I personally believe that there should be better cooperation amongst Caribbean countries as to how best we can pool resources to be able to have some centers of excellence within the Caribbean where patients can go to get treatment when they have these advanced disease at a reduced cost. I see it impossible for it to be at zero cost because of the just economics of it. But if we're able to come together and have a West Indies or Caribbean Institute of Health that truly pulls resources from Trinidad and Guyana all the way up to Jamaica. And we able to come up with strategic goals and decide where we're going to strategically place these tertiary care hospitals that can give specialty care in heart disease, or a specialized cancer center, or a specialized endocrine center, and have a way of giving access to those specialized hospitals through shared responsibility and shared resources. I think that would go a long way in improving our health in the Caribbean, instead of each country trying to do it on its own. It's impossible. There's no way that can happen. And I think if we come together as the West Indies, or the OECS, or whatever name you want to call it, then we have greater bargaining power with drug companies, so we can get medicines cheaper. We have better bargaining power with device companies. So, the things that I do here, we'll be able to advocate as a block to get these equipment, etc., at cheaper costs, because there is unity in strength in this, or strength in unity. In this case, unity is strength. And I think our Caribbean leaders need to reassess how we go about the process of giving healthcare to our population. And
yeah, go ahead.
And finally, we have to make it easier for people like me in the diaspora to be able to engage back in our communities and in our countries, to be able to give lectures, impart knowledge, education, and also create an environment where we can give back some of our time to helping that process along. It shouldn't be an uphill climb for anyone to try as a physician to go back to Grenada to give 2 weeks a year, for example. If there's some sort of a process that can be started through the ministry or through St. George's University or whatever, that can allow people to then say, I'm available this time, and I'm available that time, and I'm available the other time, and come up with a roster of people who can then rotate through the country and provide care from a specialist and even non-specialist level, then that would take care of a lot of our human resource issues. I know a lot of people who want to help, but the constant complaint is the inertia and how difficult it is to get these tasks accomplished.
Okay. Well, I can tell you already, I believe as the OECS, we do purchase medicine as a cluster, so maybe we need to use that as a starting point to get us to some of the levels that you mentioned in terms of the collaboration between our leaders and so on. Well, probably you should be a mentor to some of our politicians in terms of the decision making, when it comes to the delivery of healthcare and other issues for that matter, because we in that state. We've come to the closing time. Any final words that you want to leave with our viewers, our listeners,
Well, I would say healthcare is very complex. Heart care is very complex, but we all have some level of responsibility that we need to take onus for. And medicines and these devices and things that I do can only go so far. And my fervent hope, like for example, when I do a heart catheterization on someone, when I'm explaining the procedure to them, I say, I'm going to do this heart catheterization. I'm going to be putting some catheters into your heart. I'm going to inject some dye into the arteries. I'm going to see if there are any blockages. My hope is that you have none. You know, that's always my hope. My hope is that, you know, what we think was a blockage is not really a blockage. So I always hope that the patient is fine and that I don't have to do anything. That makes my life easier. It makes the patient's life easier. But if there's something to be done, you know, I embrace it fully and get it done. I would hope to be able to contribute more to cardiovascular care in Grenada on a more regular and deeper level. Hopefully our discussions that we're having with that are ongoing will lead to some fruition. And don't forget mental health. That part of it is lacking in terms of the way we look at patients. We see patients simply as biological beings and not, you know, necessarily mental or spiritual beings. There has to be, you know, some effort and thought and emphasis given to spirituality. I believe in God 100%, but I don't care what you believe in. I think having some sort of spiritual grounding does help in terms of relieving a lot of mental stress, and that relationship between biology and psychology and mental health, you get to some sort of a balance by doing so. Never forget family. My family has helped me to be where I am now, and I think the biggest challenge for me going forward is balancing time between family and profession. I have two wonderful daughters, aged 9 and 8, and the next step in my life, I see growing or helping them grow as being probably more difficult and more critical than seeing my career move forward, because I would hate to be an accomplished cardiologist but then leave my 2 daughters behind. So we always have to remember family, try to look out for what's best for them, be inclusive, and never stop being positive. I think having a positive outlook on life is essential. That gives you perspective and that gives you balance. So be as positive as possible. Don't be afraid to take risks, to challenge yourself to be better. You need to get out of your comfort zone. You know, my team, they know me very, very well. Anytime we get comfortable with doing something, I feel uncomfortable when I'm comfortable. Let's just put it that way. Because if I'm comfortable, it means that I'm not growing, I'm not progressing, I'm not pushing myself forward. And I try to instill that in my team. I try to instill that in my family, in my kids. So don't be afraid to be uncomfortable. When you're uncomfortable, it means that you're moving forward. If you're sitting still, there's nothing to do. So you're comfortable in that position. But once you start climbing that hill, then you become uncomfortable. That pushes you to be better and makes you a better person, a better human being, and puts you in a position to be better able to serve society and serve humanity in general.
Thank you very much, Dr. Triston Smith. And before you leave, we see it's Dr. Triston B.B.J. Smith. What's the B.B.J.?
Happy that you asked that question, because a lot of people ask me that all the time and I don't say it. It's Bart by Jord Jr.
Bart
by Jord, Byjorde.
Okay, Junior. All right. Well, thank you very much for taking time off your undoubtedly busy schedule to be here with us. I know many people would have been very enlightened by this conversation. I see some of the people in the chat room. I see that Mila Holder, who is a regular guest, Alice Macklin, they are commending the presentation here this afternoon. And we look forward to having you sometime again in the future if you can find the time.
Anytime, anytime. Thank you very much. I'm
All
always
right.
available to help impart education, knowledge, skill um, to my compatriots at home at any time. Thank you very much, Pablo.
Okay, so that puts a wrap on the comfort zone for this afternoon.